Hello, and welcome to Chad's ADHD 365 podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Takeda, Better Health, Brighter Future. Hi, I'm your host, Susan Booning, and I'm here today with Dr. Carey Heller to talk about how to help your child overcome executive function challenges. Hi, Dr. Heller. What are executive function impairments and how do they relate to ADHD?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm happy to be here today and talk about all this. It's interesting because people talk so much about the term executive functioning or executive function impairments, but a lot of times people don't actually take the time to stop and define the term. And it can be confusing because I think sometimes there can be slightly different definitions. But for our purposes, executive functioning in general are a set of mental processes, or another way of thinking about it is an umbrella subset of skill sets. So basically, underlying idea of executive functioning are things like working memory, prioritizing, planning, task initiation. I get kind of getting yourself started. So basically, you have all these different skill sets and attention too that sort of work together to help someone to be able to complete a task or participate, properly in an event. But basically, without these skills, you're not going to get anything done or probably function on a day-to-day basis very well. And in terms of this question of ADHD, I mean, this is often one that people think about. Contrary to the way the criteria is set up. I mean, like I view it as by default. If someone has ADHD, if you look at the criteria, the majority of the criteria relates to executive function weaknesses. Think about the idea of self-regulation of attention. So essentially, if someone has ADHD, they pretty much have executive function impairments. However, someone can definitely have executive function impairments without having ADHD. So, for example, anxiety, depression, OCD, lots of other things can mimic or can cause executive function impairments, but really are not ADHD. So the bottom line is, if you have ADHD, my opinion is that you by default have executive function weaknesses or deficits, but you can definitely have EF weaknesses without having ADHD.
So, what are some standard intervention strategies for attention and for executive functioning deficits?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say probably one of the biggest, overarching general principles is the idea of structure. What's interesting is some people that have a lot of issues with attention and executive functioning, in theory, thrive on structure, but really dislike it. So I think really structure is really crucial, but I think you have to have the optimal amount of it, because too much can be very hard because people don't feel like they have any flexibility, and they feel like if they start doing something that doesn't work properly for the structure, then they're sort of out of luck, and why follow a plan? So you have the general idea of structure, and then things like a calendar, task list, some sort of planner, automated reminder systems, essentially having very simple ways for someone to keep track of, tasks in terms of what they need to complete, reminders to be places at a certain time, essentially having the day planned out for you. It can be kind of some good strategies, both for kids and adults with attention issues and executive function weaknesses. Because if you have no idea what you need to be doing in the first place, it's really hard to focus your attention on something particular if you're not really even sure where you're supposed to be doing in the first place.
And using accommodations or interventions to help a child cope with their emotions and applying skills to improve working memory go hand in hand?
In a lot of ways they can, but I think they're obviously each person is different. So I think it depends what the accommodations are, and obviously what the person's particular presenting issues, even with ADHD or executive functioning issues, are. If you think about accommodations in terms of school accommodations, whatever's written in a formal plan, may be really helpful, but it also depends how it's actually executed. Because, certainly emotions are something that people don't think about a lot, but certainly can be a huge issue, both with executive function deficits in general and with ADHD, because when you think about this idea of self-regulation, if someone has a hard time managing their emotions, they may get overwhelmed very easily. They may be overly sensitive, and so little things really bother them, and then the emotions kind of can go from 0 to 60, even for something that may seem very minor. So the idea here is that by creating various strategies, whether it's a cognitive behavioral tool to kind of count to 10 to extent you can before reacting, to sort of do something like take a couple deep breaths in and out. There's lots of different strategies that people can use to help regulate their emotions better. The other piece of that is you think about memory. So in like an optimal optimal functioning, someone may have differences in, let's say, how good they are remembering things. But if you take that and on top of that add someone that's having a hard time in the moment managing their emotions, difficult emotions are probably in most cases going to impact the accuracy of someone's memory, because certainly issues of emotion regulation may lead to not remembering stuff as well to begin with. It may also lead to lapses in attention more so, and put those together, clear it can really impact a lot in terms of memory abilities. I mean, same thing with other things. Think about sleep. Almost anything that can negatively impact someone away from their optimal level of functioning is going to impact attention and memory, as well as lots of other things as well, processing speed and other things too.
What strategies can parents learn to help a child be more motivated?
So a good question, one I definitely get asked a lot. I think it's hard because I think from an outside perspective, a lot of parents and caregivers often think, this is my child's required to do this for school, or I want them to do this. They should be motivated naturally to do it. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Like, I view motivation as internal and external. So internal motivation is things that people inherently want to do or see the value in. So for example, like in theory, people, it would be good if they're internally motivated to, let's say, work hard, put forth their full effort, do their best to do well in school. For some kids or adults even, that works really well. For other things, especially when it's not something someone really has an interest in, it can be harder. So in terms of how to help foster internal motivation, trying to find things that your child like naturally seems motivated to. So whether it's building with Legos or running or something with sports, figure out like, by finding that thing that really motivates them to begin with, you can then look at like what's involved in that activity that they really like. And could you find like aspects of those skill sets involved in other things that maybe are less enjoyable, and use that to help apply this, to help them develop this internal motivation? Or for example, like one thing, let's say with maybe middle school and high school students, could be if, let's say, the child feels or teen feels like, oh, this class, I don't need to know this material. I mean, maybe it's true. Maybe in theory they really don't need to know, I don't know, something about math if they really don't have a huge interest in going to a field that requires that a lot. But the skills involved can often be really helpful, even if the material itself is not going to be as useful potentially. And again, you also really never know for sure until you get older. But the idea here is, even if they have that perception, oh, this isn't going to be helpful to me, the skills probably will be. And so helping them to focus on, I may not necessarily get much out of this material, or maybe I don't like the teacher, but by learning these skills, it's going to help me in a lot of different ways, now and in general down the line. In terms of external motivation, and this one in some ways is even trickier, because on the one hand, you can probably create different strategies and systems to help your child to be externally motivated. So whether it's giving them a reward for doing something, or it's the idea that when the natural thing that occurs from doing something is not inherently rewarding enough, that's when creating, let's say, a reward system of, they earn X number of points for, let's say, handing their homework each day, and then maybe they get a prize of some kind. The issue here is that, it walks a fine line, because on the one hand, you can set this up, you have to be careful that it doesn't turn into your child wanting or expecting to earn something to do things they should be doing anyway. I mean, I just remember there's an old psych study that looked at piano playing, and it looked at how when a child was given an external reward for doing something they enjoyed anyway, they actually became less interested in the activity. Especially when the reward was taken away. So the idea here is that you want to figure out how to basically think about it as like a short-term fix to help develop a routine or habit. So if, let's say, a child has a hard time turning their homework regularly, that maybe if the internal motivation is not enough, you create an external motivation by creating a prize system. Or maybe, let's say, for, I don't know, every day that they turn in all their homework, they get, I don't know, 2 points. And then if they do it consistently for an entire week, maybe they get an extra 5 points on top of that, and they can trade it in for something. But the idea is, like, once they consistently can do it without, with the reward, then maybe you either pull away the reward, or maybe you then, shift the reward to something else that needs to be addressed. Because then this way, if you keep it in place too long, once they've mastered what they need to, it's going to make it a lot harder for them to sort of continue to be motivated to do it down the line. But basically, by putting it in just long enough until it becomes a routine, then they're going to, hopefully, the idea is over time, develop that internal motivation to sustain that skill set that they've developed better.
Let's talk a little bit about strategies for emotional difficulties. What strategies could help a child to be more self-aware and able to work through their thoughts and feelings?
I mean, so this is interesting, because this is one it's definitely, these are crucial skills. The hard part is when someone's really riled up, it's hard for them to remember to use strategies in the first place. And like, I view this as sort of two prongs. So you have, on the one hand, you have in the moment strategies, which I'll mention in a minute, like specific ones of how to kind of, calm yourself down and handle situations in the moment. But on the other hand, the other big part of it is doing stuff on a regular basis to kind of prevent things from happening in the first place. And so you have kind of, by being proactive with the strategies not in the moment paired with ones in the moment, the two together can often work well. So in terms of specific strategies, I mean, in the moment, like let's say something's occurring at home, it's probably easier for a parent to, draw their child's attention to, did you notice what just happened? To look at kind of what was the trigger. So identifying the trigger in terms of, what happened, what led them getting upset, and then looking at, how could they have handled it differently? I mean, sometimes you do need to wait till someone's calm after this fact to be able to process it with them. But basically, by reviewing situations with kids, as soon as you can after they occur, and maybe it's, writing down using a chart of some kind. So maybe you identify the trigger, so what was occurring before, let's say they reacted really strongly. What were they thinking at the time to the extent they can remember it? How did they handle it? And then, was that an appropriate way of doing it? Or what could they have done differently? So by essentially processing situations, soon enough after they happen, it can help kids to recognize, down the line, to sort of get to a point first, maybe where when a situation similar starts, they, maybe they react a little bit, but then they can start to stop themselves. And then you get to a point ideally where they don't even react in the first place. So I think, basically processing situations after they occur when you can work really well as sort of a proactive strategy towards, preventing these issues from happening again. Other things sort of in the moment might be, basically the idea of having kind of a cool down period. So instead of, probably the most standard stereotypical, consequence is a timeout, especially for younger kids. But the question then becomes, in theory, like you want to give kids a break from what's going on, help them to calm down, but you want to focus on the calming down piece, not on the consequence. Because I'm sure any of you listening that have kids that have tried to, your kid's not doing what they're supposed to, and you start saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to, you're going to have this taken away. Most kids, if they're riled up enough, they're not going to care in that moment. They're going to be so upset about whatever's going on that they're not going to care what consequence you give them. But the idea is you can focus first on the calming down. So that's where, maybe you give them, like you could set up a corner where, instead of like a stereotypical timeout, you have like a place where they can go, but, they have like certain things, like maybe they have an exercise bike to sort of get some energy out. Maybe they can have, coloring or drawing. But the idea is, set this up ahead of time and have it ready to go. So literally they know they can go to that corner when they need to cool off. And so get them to cool off first and process those emotions. And then if you have to, then talk about a consequence, but focus on the kind of the regulation piece first, not the consequence. So those are, a couple of things that could be really helpful sort of in the moment. Other things, counting backwards from 10 or taking a few deep breaths in and out. If kids need to, they can imagine themselves, blowing out candles, or imagine themselves, watching clouds go by. If they're calm enough and it makes sense to, you could also, there's lots of apps you can use like Calm or Headspace. And they have both of them have sections for kids. Headspace has some good visual ones where it has ones of clouds. So you can take a few deep breaths in and out and like watch the clouds. For really little kids, there's a one, I think it's a breathe something think. It's it's basically Sesame Street. And it has the Sesame Street characters, and there's like a Cookie Monster. And you can, your child can kind of follow along and, breathe in and out with Cookie Monster, and you can rub its belly. And, there's some other fun stuff for real little kids that, as long as they're calm enough to not throw the device, or you can sort of hold with them, can work really well to help calming down. Because that's the bottom line. You want to work on calming down first. The consequence really should be secondary and be used more as a preventative thing in the future, not as a, the primary motivate thing to address when emotions are at play. And then the other key thing is, again, you really want to look at what could be done differently next time, because there may be times where it's not all the child. It easily could be, well, obviously the child still needs to learn to regulate ththings themselves. If, let's say, the parent yelled or reacted in a way that maybe was most appropriate, that can be something to maybe for the child and the parent to look at together to talk about, maybe, I know you didn't handle this way, but, maybe I didn't either. And so what can we do together to make sure that this goes better? So, for example, if maybe the trigger in this case was, I don't know, the parent was in the middle of doing something for work and the child interrupted, and then the parent got angry and then the child got angry. Then looking at, maybe the parent could say to them, I need 5 minutes to get this done. Please, I will come get you in 5 minutes when I'm ready, and I'm happy to help you. Because that's where it's also a team approach. And same thing, with teachers, like in theory, it would be great to be able to do that. And sometimes some teachers are very receptive to talking about that. Other times teachers are not really going to take ownership when they've had some role in the child sort of reacting very strongly. But it's, again, it's not one size fits all. That's where you really want to look at a couple of different sort of approaches. Like I mentioned, like the timeout corner, the log of of triggers and before and after, the breathing, the meditation, or other things along the lines of meditation. There's a thing called guide visual imagery, where you can basically, they have pre-made scripts, you can make your own. Innerhealthstudio.com is a website that has some ones you can basically download. They have pre-made ones you can listen to, as well as scripts, so you can basically take it and then adjust it and write it however you want. So the idea here with guided visual imagery is that rather than focusing on yourself directly, you listen to what's being said. So maybe it's imagine yourself walking through a forest. Listen to the sounds of the birds chirping and the leaves crunching under your feet, as you kind of walk past. And then, there's another one where, maybe you walk to a clearing and there's a beach and you can listen to the sounds of the waves and, the birds flying overhead. And so the idea is by creating this imagery, it kind of takes your mind off of whatever's going on. But the crucial part is throughout it, they're often having you kind of breathe in and out. So you're kind of still getting the same idea of breathing. And the reason behind that is that when people are upset with, issues of emotional regulation, they're often, their heart may be racing, they may be breathing heavily. So the idea is by creating their homeostasis, getting them back to kind of their calm state, that can help them to people to feel a lot better. I mean, adults too. And so that's why, whether it's a meditation program or guided imagery, there's often that big focus on the breathing. I mean, other like very simple like breathing techniques you can use are you can get your child to lie down, put a very have them put a pillow on their chest, and the idea is to breathe in and out slowly enough that the pillow doesn't move. Or you can also use one nostril breathing, where basically you put your finger over one nostril and breathe in and out really slowly for about 10 to 15 seconds. The idea is it may sound really strange, but basically because it constricts your breathing just a little bit, it allows you to be able to it allows you to sort of get back to homeostasis state faster. I mean, of course, you always want to make sure that it's safe for your child to do that. And the idea is really that you don't want to, you want to hold a little bit. You don't want to block your actual breathing in any way. It's really just the idea that or you can do it even with a straw too. Breathe in and out slowly through a straw. The idea is just it just forces you to slow down your breathing a little bit more if you need that extra kind of physical piece to help guide you on that. But again, I mean, there's a lot that you can really do to sort of help with the self-regulation of emotions. But because, everyone's different, you really want to also, incorporate your child into this discussion. So maybe, when there's a situation where things didn't go very well, once they're calm, talk to them about not just what could we have done differently, but let's come up with some strategies of what we can do when this happens again, and then even write them out. So this way, maybe you have a chart somewhere in the kitchen or somewhere easily accessible where your child can see, oh, I'm getting upset. I can, count backwards from 10, or I can, access the app and do some deep breathing. So the idea is by also including your child in the discussion, it helps them to take ownership of this and not feel like, oh, here are the strategies my parents are making me do. Because it's often hard enough, even for adults, when they're upset about something, to use strategies that they know they can use. And sometimes you may get more pushback from a kid just because they're really upset, even when you're offering things that under normal circumstances they might be really happy or willing to do. So by kind of helping them to learn to do it themselves and have access to this stuff, it will help them to, over time, be able to use this more themselves when they really need to.
And that's really an important question, is how parents can help with fostering self-awareness in their child so that they can try a lot of these strategies, and they're great and they're very effective. But at some point, the child's self-awareness hopefully will help them to utilize these interventions or strategies before they fly really off the handle. Can you talk more about that and what parents can do to help foster that kind of self-awareness?
Sure. I mean, I think what's hard is even for adults too. Sometimes it's really hard to see what do you look like on the outside when you're doing this, or what's going on. So, I mean, other things you can do. Again, I would not do this necessarily without your child's permission, and I would probably not advise doing it in the moment when they're really upset. But if you can sometimes work on the self-awareness for situations that really are not as emotionally charged. Like, for example, if I don't know, they're doing some sort of activity like a family game, and I don't know, you set it up where maybe you video record everyone playing for a couple minutes, and then you play it back to the child. That the child's probably going to see things from that in the video that they just never noticed themselves in what they were doing. And even it may not be anything emotionally charged, but the idea is by having opportunities to kind of see outside of yourself and see what happened. Like, even if maybe the child, I don't know, is starting to get a little frustrated, they in the moment may not have perceived at all that they were getting frustrated with the game, but looking at the video, they may say, oh wait, now I do actually see how that could be perceived as my getting kind of upset about this. Or even like self-awareness with other stuff. Like, for example, a child may have absolutely no idea that they're fidgeting so much. And, seeing that on video may get their attention a different way to say, oh, I realize that is actually occurring a lot.
What different processes can help my child to work through solving problems?
I mean, I think it depends on the child. I think for some kids, they need like a very structured approach to like, here's what's going on. Like almost like if you like for such, especially for kids that have a real hard time, and this may be for parents too. Like for example, setting it up in almost like a courtroom where basically you have like the structured system of, the child gets, X number of minutes to kind of state their case, explain what happened from their perspective. The parent gets a turn and then the child gets a rebuttal. I mean, sometimes you don't have to structure it quite that much, but for some kids where they feel like it's really hard to kind of stop talking or let the other talk, like having that preset structure can be really helpful oftentimes. So, or it's whether, I mean, certainly I'm sure you've probably seen some movies at this point or TV shows of, you hand someone a stick and only the person with a stick can talk in the moment. So, things like that. Like the idea though, in general, is it's good for a lot of stuff to have it written down, to have a plan of action before issues occur. Because if you're only trying to create a plan to how to approach stuff once an issue's already occurred, it can often be harder to. So by having these plans in place ahead of time makes it a lot easier to diffuse situations more easily and hopefully prevent things from happening again.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with parents about helping their child overcome executive functioning challenges?
Sure. I mean, one of the other big things with it, I would say, is that, I mean, besides I've said several times already, one size does not fit all. What works for you as a parent may be drastically different than what works for your child. And so recognizing there are individual differences in how people approach things is really crucial. So better understanding like what's going on. Like if it's keeping track of assignments, if for you, you would think, oh, I'll just write down a paper planner and that doesn't work for your child. You may want to look at not just that it doesn't work, but why. So is it that they can't get it out quickly enough to write it? Are there issues with handwriting so it makes it really hard to write it down? And then figuring out from there what could work better. So, because there's a difference between if it's more of a mindset of, oh, everything's in a school portal, I don't need to write it down, versus I just can't remember to do it. Because the more information you have on like what's going through their mind when they're having trouble with something and what works or what doesn't work about strategies that have been suggested, will help guide you a lot more in terms of, I think a collaborative approach will hopefully help a lot more with being able to help your child to find tools that work for them. And also the other thing too is you can also, while stuff that works for you as a parent may not necessarily always work for your child, if you can weave kind of demonstrating sort of good executive function skills into kind of your daily life with your child. So for example, if they say, can you remind me of this? Then you may say, I mean, I could, but is there a way you could think of reminding yourself of it? Or maybe, just by watching you, let's say, I don't know, use an Amazon Echo. And basically, if you use that and actually set reminders, sometimes your kids may see that and may start using that themselves. Or if, they have, let's say, access to, an iPad somewhat regularly, maybe, if you use the reminders app, maybe share a list with them and then, gets them in the habit of using it, or same thing with a calendar. Because a lot of times, kids do watch, especially younger kids. And by just seeing what you're doing, even if you're not directly, saying you should do this, some kids will just pick up on just seeing you do it and may recognize, oh, this actually be helpful. Let me try doing this. The final thought too is really just about flexibility. So one of the biggest things I see is that when someone tries to use structure to make a plan, they feel like, oh, it's not going to work perfectly. So no matter what I do, my plan's not going to work, after the first thing, if that. And so why bother? Whereas while structure is really crucial, you have to have flexibility in a plan. I mean, no matter how good you are planning, nothing's going to work perfectly. There are going to be things that you have no control over that come up. Things may take longer than you think. So it's important to have a plan, you structure, but also to allow room for flexibility in that as well.
Thank you so much for all these helpful suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely.
This podcast was sponsored by Takeda. Better health, brighter future. Thank you for listening to another episode of Chad's ADHD 365 podcast.